It is a great delight for me to be here this morning, and I say that partly because I think that what Tom Rollins has done in founding the Teaching Company is a testimony in equal parts to his genius and to his boldness. I say that in part because you have had the genius and the wisdom to show up to attempt to learn something about the Old Testament of the Hebrew Bible, and I say that partly because it's so much fun for me to talk about it. If you ask me, what in life do you most enjoy? I would talk about fishing for trout and salmon, and I chase trout and salmon with my fly rod from Iceland to Alaska with lots of stops in between. I would join, I suspect, all of you who are parents and say, well, if you get right down to it, there's not much in life I enjoy more than talking about my kids, and I'm glad you asked. But I would also include in any such series of comments about what I most enjoy reading the Old Testament, thinking about what the Old Testament is all about, and attempting to make sense of it for others, and that opportunity you have given to me. As intriguing as is the world of the Old Testament, and an introduction to that world we're beginning right now this morning, it is also a powerfully complex world, and because it is a powerfully complex world, what I'm going to do in the first lecture, and I know all of you in this audience and others who will have access to this material have an outline for this, as for other lectures. What I'm going to do this initial lecture is to, in part, give you an outline of where we have been and where we are going. And one of the reasons we need to do that, and one of the reasons I want to make sure I do this initially, is the following. We're going to follow a procedure in going through the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, which at first is going to seem powerfully curious, but which I suspect after a lecture or two will feel increasingly comfortable and I hope increasingly commonsensical. Because what we're going to do is this. We're not going to look at the books of the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament in the order in which you find them as you open your Old Testaments. We are instead going to look at the books of the Old Testament in the order in which they fall historically. That is to say, if I were to pick up my Hebrew Bible, and it is an authentic Hebrew Bible up here, which I will be using throughout this course, I would begin with the book that's called in Hebrew Bereshit, the book that's called in English Genesis, and then I'd get to Shemot, the book that's called in English Exodus, and then I'd get to Vayikra, the book that's called Leviticus, and I would conclude with Divrei Hayomim, Aleph and Beit. And those are the books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. If you've got another English Bible, an English Bible based upon Christianity's canon, which is based on a Greek Bible, your Bibles will begin with Genesis, but they will end with the book of Malachi rather than with 1st and 2nd Chronicles. That's one way to do the Old Testament. Start at the beginning as you read it. Now, basically, the beginning for this book means the right-hand side because Hebrew is written correctly from right to left rather than perversely from left to right, as is English. One way to introduce oneself to the Old Testament of the Hebrew Bible is that way. We're not going to do that. Instead, we're going to go through the history of the religion of Israel, and at each point in that history, when we come upon a document in the Old Testament of the Hebrew Bible, we will talk about it. I think it is far and away the best and the clearest way to talk about the Old Testament, but it will initially seem a little bit complicated, and hence the reason why I'm going through everything the way I am in this first talk. I have 3 tasks that I wish to accomplish, and I know I can accomplish 2 of them, and I think I'll get fairly through the third of them, and perhaps entirely through it this morning. They are first to talk about the course of the course. That's Roman numeral 2 on your outline. What's this course going to look like? Secondly, I'm going to ask a blatantly commonsensical question, and I hope give to it a less than commonsensical and intriguing answer. And that question is, what is the Old Testament? And then finally, I'm going to conclude with something that, in fact, you will find reappears throughout the following 7 lecture, and that is an outline history of ancient Israel. So let's begin at the beginning with an outline history of the course, and I'm going to precede that outline of the course by a few comments on the ancient Near East. As one counts powerful empires, as one counts nation states which were important in economic, especially in political terms at the times, ancient Israel is not a major power. Ancient Israel never acquired anything like the status of an ancient superpower. Now, in terms of influence upon Western civilization and upon the rest of history, of course, Israel's power is immeasurable. but compared with other nations in that part of the world, it was a small and a fairly backward one. The superpowers of the ancient Near East were above all Egypt and the two nation states in ancient Mesopotamia, Babylonia and Assyria. And you will find me fairly often in this lecture and in the 7 that follows, talking about ancient Egypt, talking about Assyria, the northern nation state in what we think of as present-day Iraq or ancient Mesopotamia, and Babylon or Babylonia, the southern nation state in what we think of as ancient Mesopotamia or modern Iraq. Now, I'm going to do that. I'm going to talk as often as I will about extra-Israelite, about other ancient Near Eastern religions and politics and economics, not because I'm a priest in the cult of some Phoenician religion. I'm not. I say that partly because after about halfway through one Old Testament course during those wonderful 14-plus years that I taught at Dartmouth, a wonderfully bright and questioning Dartmouth student came up to me and said, "Excuse me, sir, but with what Syrian religion are you affiliated?" And she asked that because the presumption was that if I was talking about ancient Syria as much as I was, I must have been accepted into the cult of some long-dead Syrian religion and be practicing that still. That's not true at all. I'm doing it rather for the following reason, that the last 150, and especially the last 100, and most especially the last 20 years of archaeology in the ancient Near East have made superabundantly clear what we suspected long before that, and that is the following, that great chunks, great aspects of the religion and the religious literature of ancient Israel were imported, were borrowed, came from, ultimately, the religions and the literatures of Israel's ancient neighbors. Now, to say that is initially to say something pretty shocking, and it's to say it for the following reason. Do I mean to say that those very religions against which the Old Testament so combatively speaks, the religion of Jezebel, the religion of the Phoenicians or the Canaanites, the religion of the Pharaoh who wouldn't let the Israelites go in Egypt, the religion of Nebuchadnezzar or Tiglath-Pileser III, or Nabonidus, the religion of Assyria, do I mean to say that those very religions against which the Old Testament so systematically rails were the religions from which ancient Israel drew an awful lot of the material that made up the religion of Israel? I do. I do mean to say precisely that. We suspected that for a long time. The archaeological results of the last century plus have demonstrated that. And let me give you one example. It may seem trivial, but in fact it's not. Rather than just talking in vague terms about how much we have learned of late about the ancient Near East and how much that has helped us learn more about the religion of Israel, even how to read sentences, how to translate particular verses, let me talk about a poetic technique briefly, a poetic technique about which we have only known for about 50 years. It's a poetic technique that shows up crystal clearly in the poetry of the ancient Canaanites. Now, you will learn as I go through here that Canaanites and Phoenicians are synonyms. The Canaanites are the people who lived in the land of Israel, including many Israelites, before there was an Israel. After the state of Israel was established, and I'll go through all of this in greater detail, the Canaanites were limited to a chunk on the coast of the Mediterranean, just opposite Crete, in fact, and became known at that point as the Phoenicians. They became known as the Phoenicians because the Greeks began to know about them, and Phoenician is a Greek term, as Canaanite is a native Canaanite term. Now, confusing for now, but the point is, people living in what was going to be Israel, and then living as a neighbor of Israel, the ancient Phoenicians or Canaanites, had a poetic technique which is easily describable and which goes as follows. It's the technique of two lines of poetry which are nearly synonymous. So if the ancient Canaanites were talking about an event, they would talk about it in one series of nouns and verbs, and then nearly repeat that in the second line. Slightly different synonyms, slightly enrich the first line, but making the same sense statement. Now this afternoon, as it happens, and none of you may be at home or wherever it's being played in time to watch on television, this afternoon, as it happens, because Georgetown defeated South Florida on Thursday night in basketball, and because Florida State defeated the University of Montana in basketball on Thursday. This afternoon at something like 4 or 5 o'clock, the Georgetown basketball team is going to play the Florida State basketball team. And if an ancient Phoenician or Canaanite were talking about that basketball game, and, presuming, not accidentally, because I'm speaking on the Georgetown campus, that Georgetown wins the game this afternoon, that ancient Canaanite or Phoenician would say the following: Georgetown obliterated Florida State. The Hoyas smashed the Seminoles. Okay? Something like Georgetown obliterated Florida State. The Hoyas smashed the Seminoles. And you and I would know what they're talking about, because we know what Florida State means and we know what Georgetown means. We know that the Hoyas is the name for the athletic teams that play from this university, and we know that the Seminoles is the name of the Florida State football team, and we know, in this case, basketball team, and we know what the words obliterated and smashed means. But imagine you're reading a verse in the Hebrew Bible and you know what almost none of those words mean, and that is very often the case, especially of Hebrew Bible or Old Testament poetry. An awful lot of that is material where for a great many years we have guessed at the meanings of words. If you didn't know this poetic technique, you might presume that 4 different athletic teams were being talked about, and you might presume that in one case it was a victory, and in another case it was a defeat. But now that we know this poetic technique, great chunks of the poetry in the Old Testament that formerly did not make sense to us make sense. I'll give you one even more concrete example, an example that comes from a prophet at whom, in fact, we will not look at great length, from Zechariah 9:9. In the 9th chapter of the book of Zechariah, there is a discussion of what it will look like when a messianic king enters the city. Now, we will see, as when we talk about the rise of kingship in this course, that kings were anointed, that the Hebrew word for anoint is mashach, that from that word anoint comes the notion of Messiah, and that there grew up in later Old Testament apocalyptic prophecy the notion that at some day a Messiah would come into existence, would enter the city of Jerusalem gloriously, and would restore the fallen fortunes of Jerusalem. And this is how Zechariah 9:9 in part, if I can find 9:9, describes what the entrance of the Messianic King into the city of Jerusalem will be like. Shout greatly for joy, O daughter of Zion. Make a happy sound, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you. Victorious and delivered is he. This is the important 2 verses now. He is humble and riding on an ass. He's upon a colt, the foal of an ass. As he enters the city, the king is humble and riding on an ass, upon the colt, the foal of an ass. Now, how many animals is this king riding on? 1. It's a portrait, a symbolic, impressionistic portrait of what it will be like. And it is saying, when the Messiah comes, he will enter the city on a beast of burden. And let me give you some examples of the kind of beast of burden on which he might enter. But we're not talking about a circus rider here, with 1 foot on one saddle and 1 foot on another. And we're not talking about somebody jumping from animal to animal or anything equally ludicrous. It's a king entering the city on a beast of burden. Now, was this ever misunderstood? You bet your boots. I can show you portraits in most of the great museums of Europe of this verse as applied by Christian artists to Jesus, and usually Jesus is riding several animals. Or there's one animal with a couple of others trotting alongside. And you will notice those. And please do the next time you look at some Christian portraiture of Jesus entering the city of Jerusalem, and there are usually several animals. Now, that's a misunderstanding of a poetic technique that the ancient Near East has now taught us to understand more clearly. What's the course going to look like? Okay, that is a comment or two on why the ancient Near East is as important to us as it is. This course it has an outline which I think you'll find is fairly straightforward, because it is the history of the religion of Israel in chronological order. Now, because we're going to go through that in chronological order, I'm going to be a little bit brief right here, but I've put on this outline the title of the outlines of the ensuing 7 lectures. Numbers 2 through 8 are the religion of Israel in chronological order. I didn't put 1 on there, except I put it in parentheses, so you could see I'm not forgotten that I was speaking lecture 1 right now, but it is lectures 2 through 8 that correspond with the history of the religion of Israel in chronological order, and that means we're going to start with the religion of the Tribal League. We start with the religion of the Tribal League, or the Tribal Confederacy, or the 12 Tribes of Israel, whatever term you're most familiar with in thinking of this, because this is the first time that there was a collection of people with enough sense of self-identity, with enough cohesiveness that we can call them Israel. Even though we can, in a sense, call them Israel, during the period of the Tribal League, it will have been tribal loyalties which still dominated. So if you asked your average man in the street, or more likely, your average man or woman in a donkey track north of the city of Jerusalem, what are you? You wanted some statement of collective identity in answer to your question, she or he would have said, I'm a Benjaminite, or I'm a Danite, or I'm a Manassite, or I'm a something like that. They would have answered in terms of a tribal identity rather than saying they're an Israelite. The Tribal League gives way to the monarchy, gives way to a period when there were kings in Israel, and that means in the second lecture following this initial one, we're going to talk about the religion of the monarchy. And that already gives you a clue to what I'm doing in a very significant sense. If we're talking first about a religion that accompanied the social and political structure that we call the Tribal League, and then we're going to talk about a religion that accompanied a social and a political structure that we call the monarchy, Israel with a king, does that mean to suggest that a people's religion bears a strong relationship to its social structure? The answer to that question is yes. It is probably predictable by all of you had I asked you to predict that, but I'll assert it once again. There is a fair amount, not a complete one-for-one, but there is a fair amount of isomorphism or correspondence between a people's social structure and its religion. And that means when the social and political structure of ancient Israel switches from a tribally based one to a nation state with a king, we're going to see some fairly dramatic switches in the way that religion is structured. And that's what happens between the Tribal League and the monarchy. The fourth lecture I'll give, and the third in our course of going through the history of religion in chronological order, is about something I'm going to call Israel's epic. Not my term, but not a usual term. Now, as you have grown up, those of you who've grown up with the Bible, and as you read either the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, and those are synonymous terms, by the way. The Hebrew Bible is one of the terms that Judaism gives to this collection. They also frequently call it the Tanakh, after Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, 3 of the chief divisions in Hebrew, the Hebrew of the Bible. Christians tend to call this collection of material the Old Testament. I will switch back and forth at will. But whether I'm talking about the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, I'm talking about the same set of documents. As you've looked through the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, and you're looking at the top of the page, you've noticed Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel. You didn't notice the term epic. What book in the Hebrew Bible am I talking about? Well, I'm not. I'm talking about the story behind the first 4 or 5 books in the Hebrew Bible, a story that I'll describe at length. But that story, the story from creation through the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, through Moses, through Israel in Egypt, and then Israel getting out of Egypt into the land of Canaan, the land that would be Israel, that story functioned in ancient Israel, as did, for example, the Iliad in ancient Greece, or as did the Aeneid in Augustan Rome. And since we call the Iliad and the Aeneid the epics of pre-Periclean Athens and of Augustan Rome, I think it's very useful for us to think of that basic story as ancient Israel's epic, and we'll talk about that. I am devoting one entire lecture to one book of the Hebrew Bible, and it's the only time I'll do that, and I do it not accidentally. The 5th lecture in our course, and therefore the first one tomorrow morning, is going to be on the book of Exodus, and I'm going to make the slightly hyperbolic, but for all that I think sustainable claim that the book of Exodus is the heart of the Old Testament. That if one were forced to pick one book which was most formative, most shaping, most descriptive of ancient Judaism, that was most central to the religion of ancient Israel. And thank heavens we don't have to pick a single book. But if we had to do that, we would pick the book of Exodus. After I talk about the book of Exodus in chronological order, and we're getting to about the 8th to the 7th century, as you will see, I'm going to talk about the place of prophets in the religion of Israel, and we will find there, as I think you will find throughout this course, a big surprise and a lot of surprises. If I could bring into this room Elijah, Elisha, Amos, Hosea, Jeremiah, Isaiah, Zephaniah, Nahum, Malachi, and a bunch of others, and I had set these folks in the middle in the aisle right here, and I said, you know, you folks are called Nevi'im, or Navi, the ancient Hebrew term for prophet, and I'm going to ask the people in this room what they think prophet means, and some of you may even have brought along a dictionary, and the people in this room standing in front of Jeremiah and Ezekiel and all these other characters say, well, a prophet means someone who can foretell future events. There is almost nothing that would more befuddle and baffle this group of ancient Israelite prophets than your definition. If you said to them, I believe that a prophet is one who foretells future events, you'd get head shaking and anger. Whatever the ancient Israelite prophets did, and we'll go through at great length precisely what they did, they would not have thought of that as anything like one of their chief functions. Well, what were their chief functions? Well, they were the reminders of ethical conduct. But above all, they were those who prosecuted Israel for breaking their agreement, for breaking their covenant between the God of Israel and them. Now, I brought this group in and said, I think berit, I think the Hebrew term berith, the word covenant, or the notion of a treaty, is where you folks belong. And I think you're here because to remind us that we've not kept our side of the treaty, and therefore to blast us, to condemn us for not keeping our side of the treaty, their head shaking and their head scratching would have turned to assent. Yes, that's what we're all about. After I talk about the prophets, I'm going to talk about the single most important, if equally most devastating event in the history of ancient Israel, and hence the single most productive event with regard to Old Testament literature, and that is something called the exile. Now, about the exile, I'll already talk before we're finished this morning, and then I'll talk at greater length, obviously, when we get there. But for now, and probably self-evidently, it means that there was a military defeat at one point on the behalf of one of those superpowers, and a part of that military defeat was that some Israelites were taken out of the land, were exiled. And the response to the exile, the response on the behalf of ancient Israelites to having been militarily defeated and then removed out of the land, produces the equivalent of Elizabethan England or the Italy of Dante. It's the most fruitful and productive literary period in Israelite religion. What does this thing mean? Does it mean that the religion of Israel is over? Does it mean that the God of Israel no longer cares about us? Does it mean that the God of Israel is not a God at all? Does it mean that the God of Israel is a God, but that there are other gods, like the gods of that country that just defeated us, who are more powerful? Does it? And I could go on and on. Those kinds of questions were prompted by this event, and therefore we're going to look both at the questions and some of the answers. And then finally, and all of this, of course, we will do lecture by lecture, we're going to look at the reconstruction of Israelite religion after the exile. And I'm going to fall prey here, as I probably will fall prey at every one of our stops along the way, to saying surely this is the most fascinating period in the religion of ancient Israel, because what folks asked at this time was the following. You know, we no longer have any political independence. We're part of somebody else's empire now. We are not our own nation. We're not in control of our own political destiny. Is it conceivable that even in the absence of our own political independence, we can stick to our old religion? That's not a question that anybody in the ancient Near East had asked before. Everybody presumed that a religion went with a nation state. And if you were incorporated in somebody else's empire, then your religion became that religion. And after the Israelite exile, somebody asked the all-important question, even though we're not a distinct political independent entity anymore, can we continue the religion of our fathers? And obviously that's a rhetorical question in retrospect, because the answer was, you bet your boots. Second major thing I want to do today, and probably that upon which we'll spend more time than any other single issue is to ask, as I said earlier today, what is, I know, a fairly obvious, perhaps even an insulting, though I hope you won't find my answer insulting, question, and that is the question, what is the Old Testament? I'm putting in Hebrew Bible in parentheses on the sheets in front of you so that you'll know whether I'm talking about Hebrew Bible or Old Testament. I'm talking about the same document. So too, by the way, when I talk about dates before the modern era, before the era of Christianity, I'm usually going to call them BC. It is, after all, the convention. But occasionally I'll say BCE, just because I happen to think BCE at the moment. BCE means before the Common Era, and it's the same date. It's just a different and less specifically Christian way of indicating a date. But I myself grew up as a Christian. I'm certainly most familiar with the terminology BC, so I will use BC. You don't need a Celsius Fahrenheit kind of guide to translate BCE to BC. If Jerusalem fell and the exile happened in 587 BC, then Jerusalem fell and the exile happened in 587 BCE. If Hammurabi, the king of ancient Babylon, began to reign in 1790 BCE, then Hammurabi began to reign in 1790 BC. So it's the same dates. You don't need any kind of a conversion formula, just a different way of talking about that. We have to ask this question, what is the Old Testament? Because the Old Testament is a particularly interesting and a particularly complex kind of document. It is most centrally, as I say on the sheets in front of you, a document that is a collection of once independent documents from many hands and from many periods. There are parts of the Old Testament, there are independent poems, as you will see, as old as the beginning of the people Israel. There is material in the Hebrew Bible as old as about the beginning of the Iron Age, which is 1200 BC. And I'll tell you which ones of those there are before we're finished. There are also parts of the Old Testament from after the Maccabean Revolt, from 150 years, 180 years in fact, after Alexander the Great, from the 2nd century BC. And I'll tell you which ones those are before we're finished. That is to say, the material in the Old Testament spans a full 1,000 years, from about 1200 BC to after 200 BC, and that's a long, long time. The period that separates the oldest from the most recent materials in the Hebrew Bible is significantly longer than the period that separates Chaucer from us, significantly longer than the time that separates Magna Carta from the latest constitutional amendment. 1,000 years is a long time, and that's how long it took the Hebrew Bible to be composed. Now, as such, as a collection, obviously what the Hebrew Bible is an anthology. And it's an anthology of works from a whole lot of different people over a whole lot of different times. And that ought to be fairly clear. I, after all, am used to anthologies. When I took English 5 and 6 when I was an undergraduate, we had the Norton Anthology of English Literature. And some of you may have read the Norton or other anthologies of literature, but there's a big difference, and that's the following. If you're reading English literature and your chief source book is something like the Norton Anthology, when you come to Edmund Spenser, there's going to be a bit of modern prose that says, listen, O audience, we have ceased to talk about the preceding poet, and now we're going to give you some examples of Edmund Spenser, who was born about 1540, who went to Merchant Taylor's School in London and then went to Pembroke College, Cambridge. And no, I don't know the Oxford and Cambridge colleges of every English poet, but I went to Pembroke College, Cambridge, and one of the things I do know is that Edmund Spenser graduated from Pembroke College, Cambridge in 1561, and then it'll tell you something about what Edmund Spenser wrote. And then there'll be another introduction before you get to Sir Philip Sidney, and then another introduction before you get to George Herbert, and one before John Donne, and one before Dryden, and one before Pope, and one before, so you know what to expect. The Hebrew Bible is an anthology without those explanatory introductions. There are 2 verses sitting together in the Hebrew Bible that can come 7 or 8 centuries apart in their time of composition. And we'll sometimes see a verse from the Hebrew Bible, which is to be dated to the 12th century, sitting right next to a verse which is to be dated to the 7th or the 6th century. And it doesn't look like it in English. And that's what's doubly confusing. If you're reading a Hebrew Bible in, for example, the RSV, Revised Standard Version, which is a 1948 revision of a later 19th century version, which is a revision of the Authorized Version, which was published in 1611, you're reading homogenized 1948 English prose. And it doesn't look like this stuff comes centuries apart. Well, of course not, because you're reading it in a translation of a translation of a version of a version. If you were reading it in Hebrew, it'd be a lot clearer. So the reason why we have to talk about this material as specifically we do as a collection is that though it's an anthology, it's an odd one from our way of looking at things, because we get these verses from very different hands and from very different periods, and nobody's there to tell us in the text itself that this comes from a different person in a different period. We're going to do it this way. We're going to say that it's very important to look at when this material was written and by whom and for whom, because a presupposition of this course, not a necessary one, and I'll give you some alternatives, but a presupposition of this course is that the historical and social context of biblical literature is the most important thing for us to know. That it makes all the difference in the world to know when something was written, to know for whom it was written, and to know why it was written. Now, I want to make sure that you understand what I'm saying, and I'll contrast it with a couple of other things. There's a very interesting thing that one can do that's not our task, that's the following. You can say, what did the Hebrew Bible mean to post-biblical Judaism? How did the rabbis who were responsible for the Talmud, how are the rabbis who were responsible for the wonderful flowering of medieval Jewish literature? How does modern Judaism read the Hebrew Bible? That's an interesting task. It's not ours. You can ask, what does Christianity make of what it calls the Old Testament? How did St. Paul? How did Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, and others who wrote the New Testament? How did St. Augustine? How did Aquinas? How did Martin Luther? How did John Calvin? How did any number of Christian figures read what they call the Old Testament, and how did they interpret this religion as a necessary predecessor to what they see as the triumphant religion of Christianity? That's a very interesting task, but it's not ours. You could do the same thing with Islam. How does the religion of Islam, began in the 6th century, regard the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, and what does it make of it? That also is not our question. Our question is, what did the religion of Israel mean to the people who experienced it? Those other questions are interesting subsequent questions. What did it mean to later Judaism? How was it interpreted by Christianity? What do Muslims make of it? But they're not our questions. Our questions are, what did the religion of Israel mean to the people who experienced it? Rather than talking vaguely, as I have been so far, about the growth of the Hebrew Bible as something that took 1,000 years, I want to give you a very specific example of how the Hebrew Bible grew, and I want to do that by looking at the shape of the story that I've called the epic. Now, earlier you heard me say that the epic is the title that I'm going to give to the main story that starts with creation, and then the patriarchs, and then Moses, and then Israel and Egypt, and then Israel out of Egypt until they get to the land of Canaan. And what I want to do is read in one case and describe for you in another case a couple of documents, one very early in Israelite history and one very late in Israelite history, that talk about that story. Because I think you will learn much better than I could descriptively account for you. You will learn something about the growth of the Hebrew Bible in this way. The first one of them, and I think I put it on the sheets in front of you, and I have, is Deuteronomy 26, 5 through 9. So I'm going to read for you Deuteronomy 26, 5 through 9. If you're wondering what version of the Hebrew Bible I'm using, again, I'm not. I will translate as I go. There are any number of wonderful translations of the Old Testament today, so I'm not going to chastise any of you for whatever one you've got. The New English Bible is great. I still love the RSV because it captures some of the cadences of the miraculous translation, the Authorized Version of the King James Version, which is as beautifully as English has ever been written, and certainly as beautifully as English has ever been translated. But the New American Bible, there are lots of great Bibles, but biblical translators take their task very seriously, and there's almost nothing that I would condemn. See, whenever I read a Hebrew Bible, such chunk from the Hebrew Bible, by the way, I do 2 or 3 sentences of fill-in so that you can all find the passage. So what I've just said, I hope, instructed you about biblical translations, but I also try to do it to make sure you can find the passage in case you would like to read with me. And I'm going to read you parts of Deuteronomy 26, 5 through 9. It has a ritual or a cultic background. This tells you what you're supposed to do when you bring an offering to the priest. And what you're supposed to do is say the following. So this thing is not something that pops into somebody's head. It's the equivalent of a Christian creed. It's what somebody says on a set religious or set sacrificial or set cultic occasion. Deuteronomy 26, 5. And you will answer and you will say before the Lord your God, a perishing, a dying, a doomed Aramean was my father. Your Bibles, many of them will say a wandering Aramean was my father. Well, it really does mean dying. But so a perishing, except perishing has that darn perishing Aramean. In English, perishing also has an unhappy sense, so I guess I better say a doomed. A doomed Aramean was my father. And he went down into Egypt, and he wandered about there, few in number. And there he became a great nation, mighty and numerous. But the Egyptians treated us badly, and they afflicted us, and they laid upon us harsh labor. So we cried out unto the Lord, the God of our fathers, and God heard our cry, and he saw the bad things we were undergoing, and he saw our toil and our oppression. So the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and with an outstretched arm and with signs and with great terror and with signs and with wonders. And he brought us into this place, and he gave to us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Okay? That's the story of the first part of the Hebrew Bible in an early summary of it. And it's got three themes. The ancient patriarch Jacob, because Jacob is an Aramean, so we know that the doomed Aramean is Jacob. An ancient patriarch Jacob, the fact that this ancient patriarch Jacob went down into Egypt, and that there was an exodus from Egypt, and thirdly, the fact of the conquest of the land of Israel. Now, if I were then to read for you, and there isn't time for me to do this, so I hope you'll do it yourselves, a long confession in Nehemiah 9, you would find the following. This confession, with three themes, Patriarch Jacob, into Egypt and out of Egypt, getting the land of Israel, it comes from a very early period in Israelite religion. Let's call it 1100 BC. If you were then to read the confession of what God did for Israel in Nehemiah 9, which comes from a very late period, the 5th or the 4th century, more likely the 4th century BC, you would find that the confession covers the same period but has 6 themes. Not 3, but 6. I'm not going to read it for you, but do it sometime. Read Nehemiah 9, and that's actually Nehemiah 9, 6 through 37. Those themes are first, creation. The God whom Israel worshiped created the world. Deuteronomy 26 didn't say anything about God as a creator. Didn't attribute any creation to the God of Israel. This one does. Secondly, you get to the patriarchal period, but you begin not with Jacob, but this time with Abraham, 2 generations before. The story's been expanded. So the first patriarch is not Jacob. It's not even Jacob's father Isaac. It's Jacob's grandfather Abraham. Thirdly, you get in Nehemiah 9 to the period in Egypt, but you'd find the story massively expanded. Not just that Israel suffered bondage in Egypt, but that there were 10 plagues, there was the Passover, there was the slaying of the firstborn. The coming out of Egypt wasn't just a military victory. It was making a wall with water on the left and water on the right, with the Israelites walking on dry land in the middle. Fourthly, you get another entirely new theme, the theme of Moses and the reception of the Torah or the law or divine instruction on top of Mount Sinai. Fifthly, another new theme, the theme of wandering and rebelling in the wilderness between the time in Egypt and the time in Israel, taking the land. And then fifthly, you get to the conquest. And that's it. And that's what you should learn from this. Look at one summary of what God has done for Israel from the early period of Israel, and you get 3 very brief themes. Look at another summary of what God has done for Israel from 700 years later, and you get 6 massively elaborated themes. The shape of the Hebrew Bible as we now have it is the same as the shape of Nehemiah 9. So the shape of the Hebrew Bible as we've got it is a shape that this material assumed sometime in the progress of those centuries between the 12th and the 4th. Centuries of elaboration, centuries of separate tribes making their contributions, centuries of new and new data added to the story. Now, in about 5 minutes, I'm going to give you 5 or 7 an outline history of Israel. Can I possibly give you an outline history of Israel in 5 minutes? I can, if and only if you will understand the following. Everything that I'm going to say in concluding Lecture 1, you will hear again. You may hear it in slightly different prose. None of us likes to repeat himself, absolutely. You may hear it like that Syrian poetry that I talked about earlier that says one thing and then says the same thing in different language. But everything that I say here, you're going to hear again. This is once over lightly so that the second and the third time it may seem a little bit more clear. Israelite history begins in what we call the patriarchal period, and the patriarchs are set, according to the Hebrew Bible itself, in a period that we would call, as modern students of the ancient Near East, the Middle Bronze period, in something like the 18th through the 15th centuries BC. And in this period, we do know there were people who wandered over the land of Israel and wandered in that territory between Egypt and Mesopotamia, who were what we would call asked nomads or semi-nomads. That means they weren't authentic full nomads because the camel had not yet been domesticated, nor would it be until about the beginning of the Iron Age in 1200, but they wandered sometimes and they settled down sometimes. And the Hebrew Bible says just that about them. Sometimes they stayed a place for a long time, and someplace they wandered about. According to the Hebrew Bible, some of these at one point, the children of Jacob and then Jacob himself, wandered down into Egypt. That's not implausible historically. And it's not implausible historically because in this period, about 1500 and before BC, there were a group of Asians. Asians mean, from the standpoint of Egypt, anybody to the east of Egypt, obviously. There were a group of Asians who were in control of Egypt, and therefore Egypt was particularly welcoming to the kind of people who the patriarchs were. Exodus and conquest. Hebrew Bible then says that there was a mighty, that the Pharaoh treated them harshly, and that there was a mighty flight out of Egypt due to the response of God, and that they conquered the land of Canaan. That too is not improbable. It's not improbable because while at one period Egypt was welcoming of Asians, at another period the Egyptians didn't want any Asians living there, and they expelled all of the Asians. And it may well be that among the groups whom they expelled was a small group who later became part of one of the 12 tribes of Israel. The period of the Tribal League is the period to which we're going to get momentarily, and again it's 200 years when tribal loyalties predominated, when there was an entity that we can call Israel, but when there wasn't anything like a king or a monarchy. The 100 years following that, from 1022 to 922 BC, are the era of what we call the United Monarchy, and that means all of Israel was under a single king. And we'll follow the way in which Israel made a development from a tribal league to a king, and then we'll see that Israel's first 3 kings are Saul, David, and Solomon. And we call this the United Monarchy because it means everything that was Israel in the tribal league period was united under a single king. There was only one king of all of Israel. And we call it that also to distinguish it from the period that comes after it, because the period that comes after it is what we call the divided monarchy. After 922, formerly united Israel was never again a single nation. It was always 2 nations, the nation of Judah in the south and the nation of Israel or Ephraim in the north. After 922, Israel is united under a monarchy for a very brief period, only for 100 years. For most of the existence of this nation, it's 2 nations, the nation of Judah in the south and the nation of Israel or Ephraim in the north. And we will see there are distinctive and very interesting ideological differences between these 2 entities. One of them ends in 722 when the Assyrians capture the northern kingdom of Israel. The second one, the nation of Judah, ends in 587 when the Neo-Babylonians, Nebuchadnezzar, captures Judah in 587, and that's the end of political independence for Judah. All of this history we'll go through again, and as we go through it, systematically we'll talk about the religious response to these vitally important historical events.